I guess I'll just get started by asking, how does this last fire season compare to previous fire seasons, especially ones within this last decade?
Uh, the 2023 fire season is probably ranked as one of the lowest acres burned in the last decade. It's up there with 2019, which is a very low fire year for us. And this has to do with the wet winter we had, the cooler summer conditions, and a little bit of luck as well.
Nice. And then I also saw our structures burned was pretty low this last year. Like, what was the one fact I found? It was no, I think it was 17 wildfires in California history have individually destroyed more than 1,000 structures. And this last season, we had about 50 structures destroyed. And I was trying to think of what the reasons for that were. Was it just because it was a lot of the fires were in kind of areas that don't have as many structures, like the Mojave Desert? Or is it just because there is so much moisture in the fuels that the fires weren't that extreme? Or was it that so much money is going into fire now that we have all these techniques and resources that we just have a much better ability to fight them now?
Well, I think it's a combination of a number of factors. One is definitely the fire season, the conditions, the environmental conditions this year were really good. High fuel moisture content throughout the summer. That reduces the flammability of the fuels, reduces the fire intensity, so fire management agencies can get initial attack, be more successful initial attack. Also, there's a lot more technology and out there, so the modeling and some of the intelligence that we have, particularly in Cal Fire, they have more intelligence with new technologies. That's actually helping as well. So I think it's a combination of factors. Obviously one of the largest fires of the season was burning out in the Mojave, where there are a few structures. So I think it's just way the conditions kind of lined up this year. Now, given a very dry year with an offshore wind event, all areas could be at risk, and we could get high structure losses in those conditions again.
Nice. So you mentioned we had a lot more fuel moisture this last year. And I know that ties back to how much rain that we picked up. But I'm curious to know, was there like a reason we picked up so much rain? Like right now, people are talking about the fact that we're in an El Nino, so maybe there's an above average chance of us having a rainy winter. Was there anything in particular that led to all that rainfall last year?
Actually, I don't know what large scale conditions we were under last year in terms of why we had so many winter precipitation events and heavy precipitation events. But one thing that was noticed, we had some really intense atmospheric river events. And so those tend to put a lot of precip in certain areas, isolated areas, and those events were scattered across the central California. I think the fact that we had such a big snowpack, what that does is that keeps the soil moisture higher in the mid elevation of the Sierra Nevada for longer. And so that keeps fire risk out of those big forests in the mid elevation Sierra. So that really helps reduce, our big fire risks in much of the state. Now, Southern California had, some fires this year and didn't have as much of the fuel moisture increase or snowpack as we did. So I think it's hard to, I can't, this is kind of off camera, but I can't link what the weather conditions were that led to these high precipitation events versus just that we had a number of significant atmospheric rivers. It just kind of lined up.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of factors that just kind of worked in our favor and just, yeah, series of atmospheric rivers. I think I remember hearing that 50% of California's average rainfall comes from like 3 or 5 big storms per
Yep.
year. And then we
Yep.
had like 10 or 12 of those. So
Right.
makes sense that we picked up a lot of rainfall. Definitely want to talk about the snowpack in a second, but staying on rainfall, we also had the tropical storm Hillary move into Southern California, brought some record-breaking rainfall. did that end up helping the SoCal fire season, or is that just kind of a novelty event and maybe most of that just turned into runoff, or did that actually help our fuel moistures down there?
What year was that, or what month was that again?
That was mid-August.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, definitely. So when you get late summer rain, like in August, that suppresses fire danger because even though there's a lot of runoff, you do increase soil moisture. And so any grasses, the 1 hour fuels, the 10 hour fuels, they're affected for, hours to days. And then even the 100 hour fuels and 1,000 hour fuels are affected by those rain events. So that really does suppress the fuel moisture conditions. And it can actually affect the live fuel moisture. Even though a lot of the plants in August are going into dormancy in August and September, it still can have an effect. So when we do have late season rain in the summer, that just helps us overall.
Nice. And then just going back to snowpack, it was one of the snowiest years on record. Could you maybe just go into the science a little bit about how that helps with wildfire? I imagine some people don't see the direct connection between snow and fire.
Yeah, we think about where the snowpack is in elevation. Uh, we had a record-breaking snowpack, in the central Sierra Nevada, southern Sierra Nevada, and what that does is that keeps the snow in the mountains longer, and so it then melts slowly. And one of the issues that we're having with climate change is that our snowpack is melting quicker in the spring, and so then we have a longer drying period where the fuels become drier earlier. But with the heavy snowpack that we had this year, that snow remained at even high elevations, even mid elevations, longer than it usually does. We had a late opening of Tioga Pass in Yosemite National Park, which is at nearly 10,000 feet. And so having that snowpack in the mountains keeps the fire risk low. And then as it melts, even though it like would melt through to August, July and August, that soil moisture from all that snow is higher later in the season versus a low snowpack year where we have everything melted out by June. Now there's more drying in the mid elevation forests, which then could have higher ignition probabilities.
Yeah, I remember, I believe it was Mammoth was still open for skiing and snowboarding on 4th of July this
Oh yeah,
last year, which is
yeah.
pretty amazing.
2017, I skied Tioga Pass like July 6th, July 4th, July 6th.
That's amazing.
Yeah, but then the other years that I did not. So it wasn't, this year was just spectacular. And unfortunately, I just didn't get out and do my summer skiing.
Yeah, hopefully this next winter. So yeah, we had it melted later in the year, partially because there was just so much snow on the ground. But then you also mentioned earlier that it was also a cold start to the year. I'd imagine that also helped out.
Yeah, we had a lot of, the spring was pretty cold. We had a lot of rain coming in late spring. It was, we didn't have a real big warm up in the spring as sometimes we do. I remember the previous year, 2022, taking photos in end of February of totally cured grass, right? So March and February usually we're, getting really, really green, and we didn't, we had lots of curing really early in the season. So that's another thing. We had late bloom, our grass fuels were higher moisture later in the season, so that reduces our spring grass fires. And once we cure all those grass fuels, then we're back to ground, right in the beginning here where we're like going to get a lot of ignition. So that has a lot to do with it. When we have the cooler weather, and I actually don't know the statistics on how much cooler it was relative to previous years, but I did see some reports that we did have a cooler spring and a cooler June. And that does play a role. If we have a lot of fog in June and a lot of stratus coming in, maybe some drizzle, that totally reduces fire risk for a day here and a day there. And so everything counts. And people, I think, forget, and this is part of this idea that climate is driving all wildfire. Well, it's day-to-day weather that really drives fire behavior. And so while we have, lots of studies showing warming trends, anthropogenic warming, climate warming, causing increase in fire risk and increase in fire growth, day-to-day weather plays a role in what actually happens and what we see in terms of ignitions per year.
Yeah, because there's lots of variability from day to day. And then there's also a lot of variability from year to year.
Yes.
Like I remember, I think we had it was the driest 3-year consecutive streak in California, followed by this last water year, which was one of the snowiest years on record. Would you tie that, like extreme diurnal, or not diurnal, but just extreme change in California to climate change, or is that just kind of how California works?
Well, I think there's been a number of studies that showed that we are getting more extreme conditions from severe drought to heavy rain and events back to back. And that studies have linked to anthropogenic climate change. So that could be a cause, but it's also, weather variability. Let's look at 2019. Wasn't a huge rain year in 2019, but we had a late precipitation. We had a lot of late rain in the spring. And if you think about 2018, we had the big fires, we had the Camp Fire in November, and then 2020 we had the Armageddon of
Yes.
lightning and all the
LNU complex, SCU,
yes, right?
EZU.
Okay, well there everybody's like, oh, that's climate change. Well, then what's 2019 where we only had 258,000 acres burned across the state? Something like that.
Yeah, or I think even 2022, I think had less acres burned even than this year. And I remember forecasting for it, there would be these big fires that would start to pop up, and then I think it was 3 or 4 of them just randomly got rain on them at like the perfect time.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, you think about 2022, we had the Mosquito Fire. We were actually flying Swiss, the San Jose Wildfire Imaging System on a NOAA aircraft. And we deployed to the Mosquito Fire with the radar. And, that was a big plume, a big fire, but it was also burning in complex terrain. It was ripping up a canyon. And so there's a lot of things, a lot of fire behavior situations that cause those big fires as well. Not only just the fuel loading and dry fuels, but burning in complex terrain. That fire was kind of the big fire of the year, the Mosquito Fire. But it wasn't as devastating as what we saw previous years. And so again, it's season to season, day-to-day variability in weather and fuels.
Yeah, so thinking about kind of season to season, I'd imagine California drought also comes into play there. I believe this time last year, 100% of the state was in drought. Now 0% of the state's in drought. That probably plays a big role with wildfire as well.
Yeah, because drought is linked to fuel moisture and the drying of the fuels, and that's what the wetter the fuel, the less easy it is for it to ignite and for fire to spread. And so those drought conditions play a big role in what we can expect for our fire season. It's hard to say what next year is going to be like because we don't know how the winter is going to pan out. It looks like it's going to be above average for precip. That would be great for a lot of reasons, for our fisheries, our water, and for fire season. So let's see how it plays out. But right now, to try to make a prediction of what next year is going to be like is going to be tough.
Yeah, I think that ties into my last question. Well, because I think this is the question that I get from the most people. Like if I mention that this last fire season, below average acres burned, only around, I think, 320,000, when it should have been maybe 1.6 million on the 5-year average. And then we talk about that's because we got a lot of rainfall. But then the main question people ask me is, well, because we got so much rain, are there now so many more fuels? And then California guaranteed we're going to drought at some point in the future. So does that mean we're just kicking the can down the road and it's actually going to be much worse in the future? And then maybe the fact that we only burned 320,000 acres this year could actually be a bad thing, because that means there are just all these other acres that didn't burn this year.
Well, we look at the new fuel growth every year in the chemise, right? And so we calculate that how much new growth, we can see how much new growth those plants have season to season. And while there is obviously more rain, there's gonna be more growth, plants are still growing and even in the low precip years. I don't know of the metrics of rainfall, and there have been some studies showing, okay, the previous year's rainfall and leaf area index in the late spring, but the relationships are not very strong. And so I think it's hard to tie that into, well, we had a lot of rain, so we had a lot of the growth, so next year's going to be bad. Granted, yeah. And a lot of people use grass fires as a metric. Well, we're going to have such a huge fuel load in grass fires. But we have grass fires. Grass fires are very common. And, I don't think we can use that fuel loading of grasslands as a metric of how much worse the fire season is going to be. Our worst fires are not grassland fires, because grass fires happen all the time. They're the easiest to suppress. They're the easiest for initial attack because fire retardant and airdrops work very well on grasslands. And so that's not really our biggest threat, I don't believe. And I'm one who loves a good grass fire. I did my PhD in grass fires. I think grass fires are very important, but when you think about the large scale, the big fires that we have to deal with, it's not the grass fires that we're really worried about. Grass fires tend to be the starting point of a large fire because it's so easy for fire to carry in grass fuels. But those fuels, grass fires don't spot long distances. While they are intense, they are dangerous. They aren't the fires that are destroying the most homes in the state because of their physics, just the way they spread and the way they don't have long distance spotting. Grass fires spot, they just don't have long distance spotting. And so I think it's going to be hard to say that in the next 2 years we're going to have a severe fire season because of this year's growth. There are some regions that may have more plant growth because of the wet winter, but we still have dead fuels. Like we still have 100-hour fuels. We still have a lot of fuel accumulation naturally in our chaparral ecosystems. That's not, those fuels don't continuously live. They die off. Like one of our sites, Blackberry Hill, we may have to shift that site because we're seeing lots of more dead parts of the plant than we do have the live parts of the plant. And that's just the seasonality, every 10 years, how these plants are evolving. So I can't really answer that with certainty, but I don't think it's actually as strong a relationship as people say. It's like, oh, we had a lot of like even this year, like, oh, we're gonna have a bad fire season because we had a lot of rain. We have lots of growth. Yeah, we might have a thicker grass crop. We might go from 2 tons per acre to 3 tons per acre, but that's really not as significant of a change as heavy fuel loads that are going to be drier, right? I think the precip, personally, I think we think about heavy fuel loads in the forests, down woody fuels that are 100 and 1,000-hour fuels. Those fuels, if it's a wet year, they're going to be moist and they're going to, not burn as easily.
Gotcha. So I'll try to just maybe.
Sorry, I don't.
No, that was perfect. I'll just try to make sure I understood you correctly. So it's basically saying like that connection between, oh, it was really rainy, so we have a lot more growth. That's not actually as important as maybe people, maybe even including myself before this conversation, thought. Mostly because plants are growing no matter what. And maybe where you do get the largest amount of increase in growth would be in the grasses, but that's not where you have the fires that are destroying thousands of structures. So maybe the better argument to make would just be if you don't have fire that clears out maybe those fuels that have accumulated for 50 years,
Right.
then that does kick the can down the road and does allow those fuels to continue to accumulate. But it's maybe less of a season to season thing and more of just a long time scale where there's large parts of California that eventually have to burn.
Yeah. Actually, most of California has to burn. We just want it to burn under perfect conditions.
Mm-hmm.
More moist fuel conditions, cooler, less windy weather. We want, ideal burning conditions to remove the fuel, but not to be the burning condition to be so severe that it damages the ecosystem, which is what we've seen in some of these very large fires in our severe years, where we've just seen devastating fire severity.
Gotcha. So maybe last question here. Just because you reminded me, I've been reading the Fire in California's Ecosystems textbook, and it seemed like they're putting forward this idea of what could be the solution to kind of that wildfire problem in California. Is they say that wildfire is a natural part of the California ecosystem. California needs to burn. A lot of the plants actually depend on fire for their survival. But maybe the perfect solution would be we use all this new technology we have, like some of the modeling you guys are doing at San Jose State, uh, some of the new air attack. They have like night vision goggles now, all this kind of stuff to suppress and put out the fires on the days where it's going to be very extreme. And maybe you tie that into modeling, you show what the fire is going to do, say, oh, this isn't a fire we should let burn, put it out as fast as possible. But then you could look at the days where maybe there's a lot of fuel moisture, it's not that windy out. And if a fire starts and the model shows that it's not going to put any communities in risk, maybe we do just allow those fires to burn a little bit. I think that's what they do up in Montana.
Mm-hmm.
But then also maybe shift more into anytime there's a day where it doesn't look like things are that extreme, you could do a lot of prescribed burning. And you could just have the contrast where continue to suppress the dangerous ones, but then actually put more fire on the ground when things are safe.
Right. And that was something called at the National Park Service, I believe, called Wildland Fire Use. So basically allowing fires to burn and monitor it. That's a U.S. Forest Service and National Park Service process. They changed the name of that a few years ago, and I can't remember what the politics were behind that, but Wildland Fire Use fires, I believe, something like that. And it's so long ago, that term's we forgot, but that was the idea, is that here's a lightning ignition. Some of these things have gone bad, by the way. If you think about some of the fires up in Markleeville, where they were Forest Service monitoring a fire, and then weather conditions change and it ripped and almost burned down Markleeville. It burned into Nevada. What was that? What fire was that? Was that
Is that Dixie or Caldor?
Nope, it was south of the Caldor. It was called I forget. It was the same year as the Caldor.
It start with a T.
Tamarack Fire.
Oh, that.
Yeah, so that was a fire that they were monitoring and letting burn, and then when weather changed, it kicked up and ripped.
Mm-hmm.
So there are situations where that doesn't play out very well, but generally that's a good tool, because you can't treat enough acres. I talked to some colleagues of mine, Forest Service, like, hey, why can't we treat? You can't treat with mechanical. You're just never going to get enough treatment. So you have to combine some thinning and prescribed fire. But prescribed fire, we need millions and millions and millions of acres burned. The Dixie Fire did that. It was high intensity and it destroyed a lot of forest. But that was a 1,000,000-acre fire that was devastating, burning communities and destroying lots of acres of forest. But if we could get fire at that scale at a low intensity, then we could really get some acres burned. But yeah, prescribed fire is needed. We need to do low intensity fires. One way would be to allow those non-critical days to allow more acres to burn and rather just suppress it. Because that's the problem we got into was fire suppression is what got us into this mess. You should talk to Scott Stevens at UC Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
He always talks about how back in the early 1800s, when Native Americans were continuously burning and there was no fire suppression in the state or in the Western US really, everything was smoky. It was hazy. California wasn't clear. The skies were hazy and smoky all the time because there was fire just going on, like lightning ignitions in the Sierras, and it's just burning.
Mm-hmm.
There was no suppression. And the forests are fine.
Yeah, I think I saw an estimate that before the era of fire suppression, California might have burned 4 million acres per year.
Yes, and I think that's Scott Stevens' statistic.
Yeah, and that's probably what maybe a lot of the plants adapted to. So that's maybe is more attuned to the natural California ecosystem.
But the problem is now we have 40 million people here and nobody can
Mm-hmm.
breathe all that smoke.
Yeah, don't want the smoke. And there's also, like you mentioned, the risk of one of the prescribed fires maybe getting out of control, or the risk of if you let a fire burn, that could get out of control. But I think the public would maybe just have to understand that there's not maybe a solution, there's only trade-offs, and that you have risk either way. It's like you can have a risk of the fire getting out of control, but then you also have a risk if there's no fire, the fuels accumulate, and then you just have some massive fire down the line.
Yeah, we need more fire on the ground, and I think most fire ecologists and most fire managers will, that's what we're saying. I mean, that's what we're trying to get accomplished, and that's what we need to get accomplished. We need to get back to more acres burned. How we do that is a challenge through the air quality impacts, the risk, the costs. So those are things that we just have to consider. But there is like some mandates to burn X million acres a year, and how we get there is the big challenge.
Yeah, I think that'll be one of the big questions moving forward. Your guys' lab will probably be one of the key places we look to for the answers.